It's great to be joined today by Luke Vargas, Chief Foreign Correspondent for Talk Media News, joining us today from Helsinki, Finland, after wrapping up a week in the Baltic and attending, of course, yesterday's Trump Putin. I guess we're calling it a meeting. I don't really know what the right way to sort of characterize it. Finland, Luke, what's it like? What is the context of Finland and sort of thinking about our relationship with Russia?
Well, first, let me say I love Finland. And I have found the language to be the most difficult thing about this country, except for this headline in the paper today.
Trump zero,
describing
Putin one, yeah.
It's the only thing in Finnish that I can understand, and I guess a fitting souvenir for this trip. This wasn't a summit, was it? We'll get to that in a second. There was no agenda, no actual deal to be signed here. Finland as a host has been described over and over as a neutral country, which, having talked to a lot of experts here, is something they sort of reject. This is a country in the European Union that's adopted the euro and that does drills with NATO, but also has an 800-plus mile-long border with Russia. And that's very important because it sort of sets up a Finnish model for how to deal with Russia appropriately that I think President Trump, in his press conference yesterday, decided not to follow. Namely, that you have to pursue a working relationship with Russia when you're Finland. You can't afford to not talk, to not have cooperation between border guards and militaries. You need to understand your partner here, but that also means you can take decisions. You can pivot to the West, or you can decide not to. And in this country, they have pivoted to the West. But they also call out Putin, and yet they still find a way to have a decent relationship. So a working relationship, not necessarily friendly relations. And that takes us to President Trump's argument here that the reason that Russian relations are being reset now, of all times, is because these are nuclear countries that together have 90% of the nuclear, or whatever Trump says, and that because of the importance of nuclear weapons control and the importance of fighting terrorism, that is a reason these countries have to bury the past, forget all the things that separate them, and just focus on finding common ground. And those in Finland would say that's a false choice. And I do think the proposition from Trump is insincere and posits that nothing can be done on arms control when there isn't just daylight, no daylight between the countries, and that nothing can happen on fighting terrorism together, as if law enforcement wouldn't pass along a tip to another country if there's a bona fide terror risk. So I think that's the false choice that has bothered me coming out of this summit.
Yeah, I mean, when it's hard to forget the past when the past includes already starting to meddle in the midterms, like as recently as yesterday, because that's maybe not far enough in the past to be able to do that. So the press conference, this was one of the most bizarre and quite frankly disgusting performances I've ever seen by an American president, certainly during the time I've been following politics. And, you know, I was doing the show during the George W. Bush administration, so that says quite a bit. But on style, what was it like in the room? Because what was transmitted through my multiple watches of this thing and preparing for the show, it was a totally subservient Trump in the context of his relationship to Vladimir Putin. Did that come through in the room, or was it a different feel?
I think it did, because many of those, including myself, who were in the room, are experienced with having traveled with U.S. presidents around the world and seeing the traditional manner in which U.S. presidents talk to foreign heads of state, and particularly foreign heads of state from less than democratic countries, of which Russia would certainly fit the mold. And typically what you see is the U.S. president making a calculation, sort of a deal with the foreign leaders, saying, though probably never saying it explicitly, you know, if you want to share the stage with me, then you're going to need to take some questions. Obama did this with the Chinese, with the Cubans. You know, they try to squiggle out of the questions. Obama insists they answer questions from the media. And Trump yesterday really did the opposite. Sort of, it was an inversion of that typical relationship. He's shielding President Putin from certain questions. It's almost teeing him up. It's like, for those of us in radio, he's like a perfect co-host, right? He like kind of senses the ad break is coming and then like fixes his remarks to give the host a way to do his live read. It really felt like Trump, especially answering or in his prepared remarks on the election, sort of saying, yeah, I brought it up. I wanted to deal with this one-on-one, but Putin has a lot to say about it. He's got some really interesting theories. Like, there you go, buddy. I felt that style to be very odd. And there was no reciprocation. And that was very noteworthy, that Putin, even though Trump was treating him with kid gloves, still criticized the United States on the Iran deal, saying, look, the Iran deal has made the world safer. It's working. And actually criticizing the U.S. on deployment of anti-missile systems in Eastern Europe, which to me was maybe one of those things Putin slipped in there to try and see, does Trump bite? Does he know the details here? Is this something he might push back against? Of course, Trump, if he caught it, didn't have anything to counter it with. And I worry, actually, that was a little bit of an indication, as we talk about substance, of maybe what Trump may have requested from, or rather Putin requested from Trump in their one-on-one. I mean, here we get an idea of a possible Russian complaint, much like Kim Jong-un complains about joint military drills with South Korea. Maybe Putin said, hey, you've got anti-missile systems protecting the Baltic and Poland. Pull those back from Eastern Europe. They're a nuisance to us. So that's something I would watch. And again, it was not a reciprocal relationship between Trump and Putin. Putin got some barbs in against Trump.
So transitioning sort of to substance, but it's still kind of related to style, and you can take this the direction that makes sense. The moment where Trump referred to Putin's idea of collaborating with Russian officials on the Mueller investigation and calling it an incredible idea, which struck me as maybe one of the most absurd suggestions Trump has made during this presidency so far. What was the mood like in the room where Trump called that an incredible idea?
I will say, and I wish I had more anecdotes about the spirit in the room. I mean, I think the Russian press corps hardly makes a peep no matter what. I guess if Putin laughs, they all laugh along with him. And I think the U.S. press corps, to be fair, is so used to Trump's antics at this point that we don't make a huge, verbal much to do about certain things. So I can't really even remember what the instant reaction was to that. But I think, you're starting to get at parts of this press conference that I do think they sort of maybe sound like one thing, but then you really consider what they mean and it becomes absurd. The other one jumps to mind for me is these two leaders suggesting they're going to have business representatives get together and find out how to do more business between the two countries, which is really against the spirit of the whole sanctions regime, which is, meant to really make Russia pay a financial price for its misdeeds in places like Ukraine and, poisonings in Europe, in the United Kingdom.
Alleged poisonings, Luke, alleged poisonings with chemicals known only to come from two different places on the planet.
Yeah, but I guess my other big point on the substance of the conversation is that, if it weren't for these two very dogged American reporters from Reuters and Associated Press who just made sure extra questions got asked in what was supposed to be or otherwise would have been a very short press conference, let's just look at the prepared statement from Trump and consider this is what he thought was acceptable at an absolute minimum to have communicated. Let's say, for instance, if the two questioners had just, talked about the Space Force and, something else that's random like the World Cup, and we never got into the meat, Trump would never have mentioned Ukraine, and he actually didn't. The only question follows up on that word to Putin. He never talked about Crimea. He never talked about the Skripal poisoning. He never talked about Assad. He ended up actually praising Russia on its relationship with Iran, which just seems very odd. And I will say, finally, we don't know exactly what was agreed to. Major agreements can be made in 2 sentences behind closed doors and may well have been made. And so it's one thing to sort of say that we fully understand Trump by reading the transcript, but that's never how Trump works. And I think we should be afraid about maybe the deals that were made behind the scenes that we may never know about.
That is absolutely what I've been thinking about. Before you went to Finland, you also were in Latvia and Estonia. You visited NATO troops, politicians. I'm actually going to be in Estonia in a few months as part of a project that I'm super interested in what that's like. But in the context of the Trump-Putin bromance, we could call it, or maybe the cuckoldry that is going on, is this something that should be concerning for those allies in the region?
Well, nothing happened yesterday from the people I've talked to in the Baltic region that amounted to, let's say, a humiliating concession that truly undermined them. We did not see President Trump, for instance, saying he was going to veto further expansion of NATO, which is one thing Russia wants. Nor did the U.S. Or President Trump agree to some sort of forced posture change for the U.S. military, agree to suspend joint military drills in the Baltic, or really even critique NATO. He reserved that for earlier in the week. And yet the Baltic probably remains the most vulnerable to Trump's temperament as it pertains to his views on NATO. This is a region that has now a deterrence in the form of these forward battle groups, of which the U.S. has one in Poland that it oversees, which, according to most people I've talked to and which I witnessed firsthand, do seem to be acting as a very strong deterrent against some sort of Russian aggression there. Those kind of vulnerabilities could come right back into play if Trump, let's say, carries through on a threat, as he apparently made in Brussels, to perhaps sort of go it alone outside of NATO if those countries don't meet these exceedingly difficult to reach spending targets by year's end, which won't happen. I will also say the country that probably, if we take the Baltic out of it, that is most concerned about what happened yesterday will be Ukraine, which got no support, no verbal support from President Trump. We don't even know if it was brought up in their meeting. And I will say, in fact, the only time Ukraine is mentioned yesterday, they are criticized by Putin, and Trump doesn't stand up for them. Putin says, look, it's actually Ukraine which isn't living up to the Minsk agreement. And there are some things they're not doing. They're not making public services, let's say, very accessible for certain people in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine. And then Putin chides Trump, saying, you need to put pressure on Ukraine to live up to their commitments. That is so lopsided. It's got to be driving policymakers in Ukraine mad.
Last thing, Luke, in the limited time we have, my sort of highlights from this Europe trip for Trump are shows up, suggests the idea of maybe leaving NATO to different degrees of directness, single-handedly torpedoes a significant portion of our relationship with Germany, which has been an ally of the United States for a long time, and then indicates that he is totally subservient to Vladimir Putin. Am I missing any of the highlights? Like, are those the lasting implications of this trip?
I think you're getting at them. How I would sum it up is that the U.S. and Russia have long had very different views about, whether they want to be in a neighborhood of similar nations or whether they want to go it alone and try and pursue, let's say, bilateral relationships with other countries where they have more influence. And I think what we've seen over the past week is convergence there, that now both the U.S. and Russia have designs to divide and conquer or divide and overpower Europe. Trump wants to do this economically. He finds the European Union to be a nuisance. He would rather make individual bilateral trade deals, not just with them, but with everyone around the world instead of working through multilateral frameworks. Putin wants to do this through foreign policy, much like the pipeline you may have talked about last week with Angela Merkel, which sort of cuts out the Baltic, allows Russia to have more one-on-one threats that they can make to different countries to cut off their energy supply. Putin sees things the same way. Trump may not know this is exactly what he's doing, but and the leaders are probably doing this for different reasons, but it's certainly happening. And finally, I would say, partisanship has been injected into foreign policy in a major way by President Trump. And he admitted it himself, sort of saying, the reason I had this meeting, the reason I'm making relations better with Putin right now is because Democrats said I shouldn't. I forget his exact phrasing, but something along the lines of, I can't set foreign policy based on Democrats who want nothing but obstructionism. He can take that tact, but it has huge ripple effects for the future diplomacy of the United States, because it makes, not just for Republicans, but for Democrats, any future successes in the diplomatic realm more difficult to actually implement, because then immediately as you come back home from abroad, even a good deal that's been signed is going to be seen as a win for President Trump or a win for a future Democrat instead of a win for America and its foreign policy. And I think that change, and the one about the U.S. and Russia starting to both agree on wanting to divide, split up Europe and deal with countries so they have maximum advantage one-on-one. Those are big takeaways that truly shift the way America acts in the world.
Follow Luke on Twitter at The Courier. Luke Vargas is the chief foreign correspondent for Talk Media News, joining us today from Helsinki, Finland.
In a makeshift sauna here.
in a makeshift, incredibly hot room. So we're going to end the interview so Luke can towel off. Luke, thank you as always.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.